Hello everyone. Tonight we start with the genius of the Mongol Empire, which was established by Genghis Khan, the man who became the ruler of the most continuous land empire in human history after being abducted as a child and having trust issues. Please take a moment to like the video and subscribe before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. You just woke up in the vicinity of the Onon River. Wool that smells like a wet yak is wrapped around you. Neither the sun nor your sense of direction have risen. Your boots are covered in frost, your nose has a thin layer of ice, and you can hear something snorting too near your head. Of course, it's your horse. He's your heating system, your bedmate, your ride, and sometimes your lunch. Here, personal space does not exist. As you attempt to stand, he steps on your coat and breathes forcefully on you. He doesn't say sorry. Horses from Mongolia never say sorry. You've already started your camp. Nobody says anything. Like smoke, they simply mount up and ride away. A youngster yawns and gallops past you with a bow the length of his body. He appears to be around 10. He is not as old as his saddle. You haven't been conscious for as long as he has been riding. After packing your belongings and tightening your sash, you mount your horse. Breakfast, a long breath of appreciation, and a stirrup ceremony are all absent. While riding, you consume dried meat. It will be by tomorrow, provided there is a tomorrow if your jaw is weak. The wind slashes in a sideways direction. Wind isn't used for ornamentation. It's the type that surprises those who aren't ready. You're riding at full speed into it. The third ridge numbs your face. Nobody takes notice. Nobody inquires about your well-being. The step is this. Either you are riding or you are a part of the scenery. You've changed horses twice by midday. Not due to your fatigue. It's the horse. It is expected of you to be more resilient than your animal. You carry more if the horse is having trouble. This is regarded as equilibrium. You urinate while riding a horse. You ride a horse to eat. You mount a horse and fight. You will be trampled if you fall off. You'll be left behind if you stop moving. No one will pay attention to your complaints. They'll just think you were caught by surprise. Everyone rides, so you do too. Because there are only two things: speed and survival, and no roads or destinations. Additionally, you are not a prisoner, because walking was reserved for prisoners in the Mongol Empire. Still, you've made it through the journey. You're still alive. That's excellent. You're hungry now, though, which is unfortunate. Since breakfast isn't a meal here, it's a challenge. A leather sack is handed to you. It sloshes. That's what you drink in the morning. Milk from a fermented mare. It smells like a saddle after 3 weeks of riding through conflict zones, and it's white, sour, and a little bubbly. Still you drink it. You don't want to, since that's what exists. We call it arag. In a technical sense, it is alcoholic. Not the enjoyable type of alcohol, though. The type of bacteria that reminds you that they are real and currently reside in your throat. This is what Mongol kids drink. Warriors also do. Grandmothers also do. If it burns as it descends, you can be sure it's effective. Food. A chunk of dried mutton may be present, perhaps. It's shriveled, drab, and so durable that you could use it to fix your boots. For 20 minutes, you chew it. The size doesn't decrease. It simply gets wetter. Some curd is also present. A sun-dried, rock-hard lump of dairy that might be used as a projectile weapon. It feels like gravel, tastes like sour dust, and causes your teeth to wonder why they are there. You think of crying, but your eyes stop before they can fall. You sit on the floor since there are no chairs, tables, or napkins. Just the smell of someone boiling something with hooves in it, wind, and wool. No spoons or forks are present. All you have are your hands and the quiet condemnation of the elderly man across from you who has already eaten, tied a fresh knot in his saddle rope, and is now honing a blade with the kind of fervor typically associated with religious meditation. You consume what is provided. You don't inquire about its nature. That is an effective method of ceasing to receive nourishment. No talking is permitted. Before, during, or during meals, Mongols don't waste time on small talk. As they ride, they eat. Quick, silent, and ready to go at any time. You attempt to keep up with them. You don't succeed. The mutton retaliates. You're not quite satisfied. You're not happy. You're a little less hungry, though, and that's a victory in the Mongol Empire. It is currently mid-morning. The horses are perspiring. You are, too. And when do you wash? You might be wondering. You don't. Cleanliness under the Mongol Empire had nothing to do with baths or soap. It's about avoiding infection-related death. Even that can be negotiated. You have the slightest hint of sourness from whatever your boots are made of, along with the smell of leather, horse, and meat smoking. And so does everyone else. Nobody says anything. You are either a spy or cursed if you arrive smelling like flowers. Maybe both. Water is not for bathing, it is for drinking. Do you wish to use river water to cleanse yourself? That's water for drinking. You want to have soft skin and die of dysentery? Proceed. If not, use your sleeve to wipe your face and continue. No soap is available. Animal fat is present. Ash is present. Sand is present. Rub your face with a handful of dust and act like you're in a spa if you want to exfoliate. You have dirty hands. Your fingernails are weapons. It's been months since you last washed your hair, but since looks is still important, it's tied neatly under your cap. Not the clean type, though, the oily type. I respect that. Lice are not removed. You control them. You give them names. While having a talk in the evening, you flick them into the fire. You spread yourself with animal grease and challenge them to continue if they bite you too much. Clothes, it's made of wool. It's rigid. It still has blood on it from a goat you kind of remember fighting with, and it's been worn for 3 winters. It doesn't change. It is layered. In winter, add more. In summer, remove it. Perhaps. There are no underwear. Shame doesn't either. What about your teeth? You are to blame for them. Not using any brushes. Don't rinse. You gnaw on bones. You consume air. You're hoping that whatever's lodged between your molars will gradually dissolve due to the acidity of your food. You always have a knife on hand for when that one tooth decides it's time to leave your skull, not for adversaries. Therefore, you do not receive a bath. You get wind. Horse sweat gets on you. The scent of unwashed humanity is overwhelming. See the bright side, though. No one else is able to detect your scent. It's time to ride into your first skirmish now that you've forgotten everything you knew about cleanliness. You spend the entire morning and early afternoon riding. Where you're headed is not disclosed to you. You're just leaving. Then you spot them. On the horizon is a collection of moving dots, you and other riders, not like you though, because they're not here to tell stories and share fermented milk. You remain calm. Nobody freaks out. Everyone simply grabs their bow. Mongol bows are lethal, short, bent, and surprisingly heavy. Layers of horn, sinew, and unadulterated intent make them up. They don't overlook errors. They never fail twice. You give your arrow a notch. Your horse continues to move. There's no slowing down. It would be humiliating. You lean into the wind, twist at the waist, and let go. It flies. Theirs does too. Greetings from Mongol combat. No dazzling sword battles. No knightly duels. Only arrows. Continuous, shrewd, unromantic shafts. Fired when galloping from unachievable distances. 3 of your adversaries are already on the ground before you've even blinking. 2 others may be re-evaluating their entire way of life and are traveling in the wrong direction. Movement is the key, constantly in motion. The adversary attempts to enclose. You intentionally back off, not out of fear. The well-known pretended to withdraw. Give the impression that you're running. Allow them to pursue, then shoot them in the face after turning around. You're dancing with someone. Quick, accurate, brutal. No yelling is allowed. No shouts of combat. Only the dull thud of impact and the snap of bowstrings. A scream reaches your ears. It's brief. You don't turn around. You have more than simply sharp arrows. They've been poisoned. It isn't intimate.c. It's useful. Let his allies waste time hauling him away after wounding one adversary. You've stopped their entire flank with the second wound. Honor is not as essential as efficiency. At this point, you may have fired 50 arrows. You can no longer count. It's okay. A bag with 70 more is dangling from your horse. You continue shooting even after your fingers start to blister, because you won't have fingers if you stop. The battle is over by dusk. You have no idea how many people you killed. Nobody does. Nobody is keeping track. It's just one thing. You continue to ride. You don't rejoice. You clean your blade. You consume food. You go to sleep, and you ride once more tomorrow. The conflict is over. Behind the hills, the sun sets. Don't sing. Not a parade. There was only the faint sound of something being mutilated close by and a crackling fire. Supper? It is assumed that you will consume what you kill. Don't worry if you didn't kill anything today. Someone did. You only need to assist with its preparation. The goat is still quivering, therefore it must be skinned, sliced, seared, or occasionally stabbed again. It's tough flesh. It is, of course. It comes from an animal who walked uphill in a snowfall throughout its life. It is roasted on an iron spit that has been in the family for a longer time than most. There is no ceremony, no salt, no spices. It's ready if it bleeds less than you do. You chew silently while seated in a circle. Like it owes the money, everyone looks into the fire. As if it might develop into another goat, a warrior next to you gnaws a rib clean, licks the bone, and then tosses it behind him. The finest part is the fat. It's rich, fatty, and so necessary for survival. The Mongols value fat above all else because it attaches to your ribs and prevents your soul from freezing at night. Not because it tastes good, it is not questioned. As if it had mistreated your ancestors, you bite into it. There is only meat and dairy, no bread or vegetables, and something in a wooden bowl that could be soup or regret. You accept a piece of organ meat if it is offered to you. You consume it. You don't inquire about life's experiences. Being curious is a luxury. A noble is not what you are. You're not a visitor. You are a knife-wielding stomach. There is no clean-up after dining. The ashes are given to the wind, and the bones are given to the dogs. You use your cloak, which serves as a winter blanket, napkin, and towel to wipe your hands. Hygiene remains a theoretical concept. There's a belch. This is regarded as courteous. You also do it. You're adapting. Congratulations. You will dream about meat when you lie in your felt-wrapped bedroll next to a snoring horse. Later, since it is also what tomorrow will bring, you'll have to ride farther till it does if it doesn't. There's no first snowflake floating poetically from the sky, no announcement. You're sleeping with your boots off one night. The next, both your boots and your will to live are frozen solid. Greetings from the steppe for winter. It becomes cold instead of getting cold. You were never supposed to be here, says the terrible, bone-deep chill that creeps around your ribs. The wind bites, not howls. It is sharp and has fangs that are aimed at your ears. You breathe in fog, then ice, and finally sorrow. Now you go to sleep with your horse. Away from your horse, with your equine companion. Like a hay and muscle lover, you press your back against its side. It's weird, you say, but at least it's warm. Clothes turns into a layering game. Fur over leather, over wool. By mid-morning, you no longer feel your fingers. The following day, you no longer feel your toes. You make an effort not to consider it. If they return, that's fantastic. Less stuff to stub if not. There is only frozen manure and no forests or firewood. Without question, you burn it. It's heat, but it smells like betrayal. Your eyes moisten as the smoke clings to your face. Your eyelashes freeze together as you blink. You now have some sculpture in you. Your water, ice. Your meal, ice. Your nose, bleeding. In any case, you ride. The weather doesn't stop the Mongols. It's not worth mentioning if it's not an arrow or a pandemic. No one seems to care that you ride with wind in your bones and snow in your boots. Not the horses in particular, who appear to like it. You are altered by the cold. Your voice is taken away, your skin is dried out, and your personality is rewritten to be more subdued, rigid, and considerably less hopeful. You stop griping because your jaw won't budge, not because you're being stoic. Nevertheless, you continue to move because you will freeze if you stop. Additionally, someone will bury you beneath a stone cairn and ride away without stopping if you freeze. Spring is not a wait for the Empire. You don't either. He does not appear to be a legend. With all the formality of a disinterested butcher, he chews a chunk of dry meat while sitting cross-legged on a simple wooden platform. He has a weather-beaten fur-lined coat. He has an irregular beard. It's unclear if the blood on his boots came from a fight, a goat, or his altercation with a tax collector last week. This is your Commander General and Khan, the man who can raise an eyebrow and order entire towns to be erased off the map. Unless someone speaks to you, you don't speak. You don't hold your gaze for very long. Even if he calls you that one with the hair for 6 months in a row, you most certainly don't alter his pronunciation. He talks quietly. Leaders of the Mongols do not yell. It's your issue if you can't hear him. Since your heartbeat is now louder than his voice, pay more attention, read his tone, or follow it. Orders are brief, exact, and final. Take a ride here. Set this on fire. Take homage. Decapitate the messenger. Don't come back till it's finished. You give a nod. Everyone gives a nod, like anxious schoolchildren, even the tough ones, the warriors who once outran a siege fire, nod. Throughout the briefing, one man coughs. He's gone now. Nobody brings him up again. Your feelings are unimportant to your Khan. Results are important to him. Was the city overrun? Have you returned with a tribute? Is the caravan in motion? Do the horses get any food? You'd better be using your severed arm as an excuse if you answered no to any of these questions. Although his tent is not opulent, it is filled with hand-drawn maps that are inscribed in a scrawl that appears to be the result of a falcon learning calligraphy. You don't comprehend any of it. He is fully aware of it. For him, countries are little treasures wrapped in poor diplomacy. Rivers are highways and mountains are little annoyances. Your orders arrive. You go, you don't inquire, you don't linger. Once more, you mount your horse and venture out into the cold. Because charm was not a factor in leadership in the Mongol Empire, it's a matter of survival. Furthermore, anyone who challenged the Khan are rarely given the opportunity to do so twice. With a message in hand, you ride into a faraway country. Today, you are not a soldier. You serve as an ambassador. You are not safe because of this. With a tiny group of people, a flag of truce, and the arrogant assurance of someone who is aware that thousands of warriors are behind you and will gladly destroy an entire civilization if your letter is not properly received, you ride. The letter is straightforward and easy to read. A few brief words written in Mongolian, Persian, or possibly Chinese, depending on the unfortunate recipient. Something along the lines of, submit to us or don't. Either way, we'll be back. Given the consequences of a refusal, it is sealed with the Khan's mark. a lump of hardened wax that could as well be soaked in gasoline. You ride into cities with silk curtains, marble gates, gilded domes, and anxious guards. You've been fed, they're questioning you. People are staring at you like a ravenous wolf who has miraculously received an invitation to supper. You are courteous, you're at ease, you take your time explaining why everyone benefits from submitting. Benefits of Mongol protection include trade, order, and a modest decrease in massacres. Refusal is met with arrows, fire, and the complete destruction of everything that resembles a structure. Occasionally, they respond in the affirmative. They pay homage. Gold daughters of horses. You give a nod, you go, you return with a report. For the time being, that city remains intact. They pause occasionally. Behind closed doors, they whisper. They send you back with presents that seem suspiciously lavish and evasive explanations. You agree to them, you grin, you take note of everything. Additionally, they occasionally murder the messenger. Unfortunately for them, this is the case. You can't use a complaint to get even. Siege engines, horse archers, psychological warfare, and inventive usage of severed heads as colorful warning signs are all used to exact revenge on you. Throughout the Mongol Empire, diplomacy moves quickly, just one message, one opportunity, not a second letter. Negotiations should not be passive-aggressive. You carry out the Khan's will. His response, if disregarded, comes strapped on the back of a few extremely eager engineers and 40,000 mounted archers. You don't quarrel, you don't bargain, you deliver, and it survives if the world pays attention. You have entered what appears to be a Mongol capital. Towers were what you expected, walls perhaps. A man in a cap is selling figs in a palace-like setting with polished floors. Instead, you come across a horde of yurts, domes made of felt, dozens, hundreds. After rain, they spread out like mushrooms, not a stone, not a marble. It smelled like boiling stuff, smoke and wool. This is the capital, Karakorum, the center of a vast empire extending from the Korean peninsula to the European border. Additionally, it appears that someone lost a sheep convention. But don't be misled, it works. Huts are not yurts. They are command centers that are movable. They can all be destroyed in 1 hour and reconstructed by midnight. A city can be set on fire. Anything that has already been consumed by morning cannot be burned. The yurt belonging to the Khan is bigger than the others. It faces south from its doorway. Always, you must be invited to enter. Its inside is filled with felt, furs, scrolls, and a throne that appears more like a stronghold to withstand a siege of visitors than a seat of authority. People from all around the empire come here. Businessmen from Baghdad, Kiev princes. They were Song dynasty spies. Sitting cross-legged and sipping mare's milk, they all pretended not to notice the woman in the corner who had just used a spoon to disassemble a deer. Bureaucracy in the European sense does not exist. No scribes in towers. Using bone styluses and a tone of mild horror, a man with a memory like a steel trap and a few aides jot things down. Laws are said aloud. They send forth decrees on horseback. Paper has value. The cost of ink is high. Errors are lethal. The streets are clean, though. The roads are secure. Like blood veins, the trade channels flow. Poverty does not exist because there is no space for it. Either you're useful or you're being made useful somewhere on a horse. Rome is not here. Baghdad is not here. The Mongols' response to urban civilization is this: mobile, brutal, effective. Not a spire, no statues, only fire, felt, and the awareness that the whole city might disappear by dawn and then resurface 5 valleys distant as if it had never existed. You take a horse. You're starving. You're chilly. It appears to be unattended. Just a short ride, perhaps 2 or 3 miles, you think. You'll retrieve it, most likely. Before you reach the tree line, they capture you. Now you're kneeling before a man whose moustache is so pointy it could be considered a weapon. He's not upset, he's not yelling, he's simply pointing at a nearby rock, then at the horse, and finally at you. Broad, flat, and prepared for action, you're going to discover something significant. There are no 16-step legal procedures, jails, or appeals. There were two types of justice in the Mongol Empire: removal or reimbursement. If you can, pay back twice as much as you took. Something else gets stolen if you can't. Depending on your attitude and the market value of the item you attempted to steal, you might use a finger, a hand, or even your skull. You make your argument, just a little. The Mongols value clarity. They'll think you're lying if you chat for too long. You hope that your 3-word explanation qualifies as a character reference. The elders talk, they both spat. One more shrugs, they then give a nod. Conclusion: you are alive. You walk, you say? That is, you don't ride anymore. The equine has vanished. Now you follow the caravan on foot until, perhaps after a season, your honor is deemed untarnished or a few. Nobody provides a time frame. When it comes to rehabilitation, Mongols are not sentimental. Either you get punished or you don't. They expect you to stay up after that. Murder? Unless there was a legitimate blood feud, in which case you owe the family labor, cattle, or a wife, you will be punished by death. Ideally, all three. Telling your commander lies. Death. Doing harm to another Mongol. Death. Hurting a protected foreigner. Double death, but with more pomp. Conversely, what about integrity, bravery, and generosity? Honored, profoundly, even if you ride like a bag of potatoes and smell like fermented dread. You are seen as valuable if you speak the truth and follow through on your commitments. Mongol law is severe, however, it is quick, predictable, and unbridlable. You are aware of your position, usually in front of a sword-wielding individual. Additionally, your hands are clean if your conscience is, for the most part. The scouts come back. Nobody says anything. To the west, where smoke rises like a promise, they merely nod. It's a city, enclosed, reinforced. The sort of place that thinks its guards and gates have significance. That's very cute. In the morning, you bike out. Engineers with carts packed with surprises are behind you. Ropes, axes, pots for fire. Collapsible sieve apparatus. Party favors in Mongol fashion. There isn't a big speech, not a boon, no drum roll. There was only the sound of 5,000 soldiers reaching for their bows and a few hand signals. You circle first, never stop circling. You observe. You identify flaws, a tilted tower, an awkwardly positioned gate, a piece of wall that appears to have been there for generations. Your captain grunts and uses a dagger to scratch something into the dirt while you mutter observations to him. Then the commotion starts. Yells, horns, fire. You don't dive in right away, you hold off, allow panic to take over. While choosing whether to bury the children or conceal the gold, let the citizens stumble over one another. Your engineers approach with their ladders and their perfectly civilized catapults every second they delay. Walls? No issue. Using resources found in the area, the Mongols construct siege towers on site. Trees, rocks, some furnishings from a monastery that was recently evicted. You're not carrying any equipment, you exude confidence. A storm is created by the archers. It's not a volley. A weather system is what it is. With the gentle thump of advancement, arrows shower down and darken the sky. After that, you ride in. You've hit the gate, as opposed to a hammer. As if the wind had teeth, you leak through the opening. The blades are out. Foaming horses, calculation, not anger, cause the eyes to narrow. This isn't insane, it's math. You are getting closer to the granary with each alley you pass. Logistics are at the heart of every corner you conquer. You do not plunder out of greed. For supplies you plunder. And when will it be finished? When the banners are torn down and the towers fall. You don't boast, you make an inventory. Who gave up? Who fought back? Who is helpful? Who is ornamental? The others disappear. Quickly, effectively. And the city is Mongol at night. How about you? You're already planning your plans for tomorrow. The banners are up. The bodies have been taken down. Now the city is silent. The silence that follows when everyone knows who is in command. You are the victor. The outsider with a horse's breath who spent this morning knee-deep in his siege engine is now studying tax codes while eating goat stew. Since that's the way it operates. The Mongol Empire did not end with conquering. It is the stage of onboarding. Expecting the usual, the people peer out from broken windows and demolished temples, decades of smouldering animosity, loot and plunder. Rather, a man in a fur coat who is holding a list of occupations greets them. Only the things that resist are destroyed by the Mongols, the others listed in a catalogue. You stay if you're a blacksmith. The same is true if you weave. Congrats if you are a scholar. You now work for a man who knows exactly how many arrows it takes to destroy a library, but who has never read a book. A formal government structure does not exist. You, a couple of scribes, and a mountain of Mongol common sense are all present. You designate representatives, ideally locals, who speak the language and are aware of how to avoid being stabbed while collecting taxes. Laws are easy to understand. Follow the Khan's instructions. Make your payment. Avoid causing difficulties. Don't worry if that sounds ambiguous. Enforcement is quite obvious. Rope after one warning. By lunchtime, trade channels reopen. The market is already selling roasted fish as if nothing had happened, and toll stations are manned by dusk since, after horses, business is the empire's second religion. You don't force your culture on others. Statues aren't made by you. All you have to do is make sure the caravans depart on schedule and the grain is counted. Identity is not a factor in Mongol governance. Efficiency is the key. You can maintain your traditions and temples, but not your disobedience. There is a tax. The census takers arrive. The same individuals who were yelling yesterday are now appreciative that the roads are safer by the end of the week. You defeated them. Indeed. However, you also made delivery times better. You're now riding west. You've never gone farther west, past the pastures you know. Beyond the cities, you assisted in sacking, past even the yurts, etched with well-known slurs. The boundary is this, the rough edge of the empire where there are many rumors and little air. No one offers you instructions. Directions are for those who have access to roadways. You receive gestures, a shrug in the direction of a peak, a smoke-filled valley with an ambiguous wave. And the Mongol compass, which never dies. Pay attention to the bones. You ride past things out here that the empire hasn't decided whether to recognize yet. Unusual towers of stone. In mid-hammer, half-built forts are abandoned. Trees that are adorned with ribbons. Presents for deities who are obviously no longer responding to correspondence. The doors of a monastery have been torn off as you pass it. There's incense inside, and quiet. A monk brings you tea, bows to you, and doesn't bat an eyelid when you scuff his hallowed floor. He's seen people like you before. He is aware of what occurs when someone declines. Then the gossip starts. Ghost armies are whispered, about cities that suddenly disappeared, about a mountain route where the brother of a Khan vanished and reappeared 2 years later, grinning and without blinking. You ride more slowly, even though you don't believe most of it. You camp in silence at night. Not a single fire. Don't laugh. Only you, your horse, and the neighboring sound of wolves engaged in religious arguments. You double-check your blade and tighten your cloak. Stories that begin, "No one who rode this way," are the reason, not bandits. Your horse is nervous too. At shadows it whinnies. And here is a horse that has napped through thunder and consumed human flesh. There are no fences defining the empire's boundaries. It has a distinct atmosphere. A reduction in authority. A logical leap. The message from the Khan comes late and is frequently whispered out here. Your instructions are still clear, but scout, watch, go back. In that order, you complete all three. You make a note of each odd village, all half-completed temples, every field with slant-growing grass, and you sense the empire behind you as you turn back towards civilization. Heavy, brutal, actual. This time, you are not swallowed by the edge. You're back. Not quite in splendor, but in unity, which is equivalent to sainthood in Mongol standards. Your horse has lost weight. You have blood on your boots. You have fewer teeth. Your scroll pouch is full, though. Names, maps, tribute totals, the odd drawing of a fortification that gave you a weird look. You give it to them. A scribe gives a nod. A commander lets out a grunt. The empire is still in existence, and one day someone will read a scroll and scowl at your name in a distant European library or a preoccupied Chinese court. They're not going to say it right. The abbreviations won't make sense to them. After 3 days of sleep deprivation, they will examine the numbers you counted with frozen fingers and conclude that they must be inflated. For history has an amusing habit. It calms the areas that give it anxiety. Historians are also quite uneasy about the Mongol Empire. They'll refer to you as barbarians. Barbarians. A mob. As though you were all a single blur of horses and arrows without diplomatic channels, commerce routes, a blood-stained judicial system, or basic reason. The engineers will be forgotten, the mail system, tolerance for other religions. The sieges will stick in their minds. Who wouldn't? But not the fact that you flattened cities after requesting their surrender, that you provided reduced tolls, calm, and order. They'll portray your face as twisted with anger, but they won't reveal the months you spent arguing with a man who only took a bath once every 10 years about water rights. They will transform your effective conquering into haphazard devastation, your harsh discipline into insanity, and your rational rule into chaos. Additionally, they will easily overlook the fact that their own kingdoms fell apart long before you arrived with a tactical plan and a torch. You don't care, though, therefore you weren't leaving a legacy behind. You were actually constructing roads. You were holding empires accountable for their fortifications. One hoofbeat at a time, you were shrinking the earth. It's okay if the world only remembers you as an eastern shadow. The precise location of Charlemagne's birth is as enigmatic as the tax returns of a monk. According to some, he was born in Herstal. Others support Ingelheim or Aachen. Around actuality, no one cared about birth certificates around the middle of the 8th century, especially not for emperors to come. This is what we do know. A kid who would go on to define medieval Europe was born in 742 to Pepin the Short and Bertrada of Lyon. Pepin was not your typical Frankish aristocrat. He had just executed one of the most cunning political coups in history. He had overthrown Childeric III, the puppet ruler of Merovingian, and obtained papal approval to establish himself as Frankish king. This indicates that young Charlemagne was born into a dynasty that had recently reimagined what it meant to be a legitimate ruler, in addition to a wealthy family. Charlemagne did not spend his early years in a field hunting frogs. He was being prepared, sometimes simultaneously, for theology, rule, and war. Poetry and philosophy were not exactly part of the Frankish educational process. It focused a lot on prayer, swords, and how to prevent rogue nobles from stabbing you as you slept. His teacher, perhaps a man named Fulrad, who preferred to recite these Latin prayers or experience my wrath over stories before bed. Little is known about the character of young Charlemagne. His biographer, Einhard, wrote about him in the same manner a fanatic writes about a famous obsession. Yet he didn't leave a diary. However, one thing is evident. Charlemagne was unique, even as a young man. In addition to being almost 6 feet tall at a time when 5 feet was considered impressive, he was a natural leader, or perhaps more properly, a Frank to conquer. Charlemagne was more than prepared to take over the throne when his father passed away in 768, at least half of it. He and his brother Carloman shared the land, as was customary in the Middle Ages. It's never good to share power during family dinners or in monarchies. Tensions naturally began to stew. However, Charlemagne was formally king for the time being. Envisioning a Europe that had not been unified since Rome, they were youthful and full of ambition. He had the crown on his head. He was holding the sword. What about Europe? The time has come for Europe to meet its new architect. A foreign invasion or a dissident nobility was hardly Charlemagne's first challenge to the throne. Carloman was the one, his younger sibling, the other crown-wearing man. In all his wisdom, Pepin the Short had divided the Frankish realm in two, giving the eastern portion to Carloman and the western portion to Charlemagne. Theoretically, this was meant to be a cooperative endeavor. Swordplay in action was a passive-aggressive catastrophe. There was animosity between the brothers. Not at all. Their courts functioned as opposing war camps, despite the fact that their realms were officially allied. Carloman was distrustful, arrogant, and perhaps just plain challenging. However, Charlemagne was already displaying the traits of a cunning tactician, and he had no intention of letting his younger brother cut his wings. Petty slights and political scheming caused tensions to rise. When Charlemagne was asked to assist in quelling an uprising in Aquitaine, it was a very significant event. Carloman declined to send troops rather than unite. The quintessential little brother action: give your big bro the credit, then sit back and let him do all the battling. Desiderius, the northern Italian ruler of the Lombards, now entered this delicate situation. In return for peace and collaboration, he promised Charlemagne his daughter as a marital alliance. Ever the opportunist, Charlemagne said yes and wed her. Carloman? This was a betrayal to him. Charlemagne was cozying up to Desiderius, who had previously backed their father. Carloman passed away just as things were about to get out of control in this medieval soap opera, easily. Carloman unexpectedly passed away at the age of 20 in 771, just 3 years into their shared reign. What caused the death? Official sources say it's natural, which in medieval parlance may indicate anything from a case of pneumonia to a misdirected glance. Charlemagne didn't waste time. He entered his brother's domain as if he had been preparing to do so all along. Carloman's children and widow ran away to Desiderius, who was now furious. Charlemagne was now in control of all of France. One man, one crown, and an expanding list of adversaries. No more brother, no more coking. What's next on that list? The in-laws. Charlemagne had a kingdom to himself and an issue in Italy now that Carloman was no longer involved, in particular, the Lombard king Desiderius. You know, the dad whose daughter Charlemagne had gotten married, only to quietly get a divorce as soon as Carloman passed away. Uncomfortable. Desiderius did not like it. To exacerbate the situation, he had adopted Carloman's wife and sons and was now publicly endorsing their claim to the throne of Charlemagne. In medieval politics, that is not only inconvenient, it is essentially a declaration of war with a bow. Charlemagne acted without hesitation. He led his army across the Alps in 773. And no, this wasn't just a mountain walk in the summer. Snow, tight routes, and the occasional unplanned landslide were all part of the Alps journey. But because Charlemagne didn't let severe weather, family strife, or mountains stop him from achieving his goals, He went ahead and achieved it. Charlemagne besieged Pavia, the capital of the Lombards, after arriving in Italy. Desiderius put in a lot of effort. Regretfully, Charlemagne was as patient as a monk copying the Bible. He waited encircling the city. Morale fell, supplies dried up, and months went by. Pavia gave up by 774. In addition to winning a battle, Charlemagne also seized the throne of Lombard. Yes, exactly. He didn't make friends with the local aristocracy or install a puppet monarch. He merely proclaimed himself Lombard king. In a medieval power grab so audacious it reverberated all the way to Rome, he became the king of both the Franks and the Lombards. Speaking of Rome, such as a bishop holding his breath during a chess game, Pope Adrian I had been anxiously observing all of this from the Vatican. The Pope had thought Charlemagne would save the Papal States after Desiderius had endangered them in the past. When Charlemagne did, he was rewarded with the approval of the Pope and a fruitful partnership with the Church that would endure for many years. The Lombard campaign was a statement rather than merely a family dispute that ended in conquest. The ancient tribal laws were no longer applicable to Charlemagne. He was establishing an empire. It was far more difficult for anyone to refuse him now that he had the support of God's emissary on earth. Charlemagne turned to face the Saxons in the north after gaining control of Italy and receiving cordial greetings from the Pope. These were not wine-drinking courtly nobles. These tribes had been encroaching on the frontiers for years, ravaging towns and disdaining all that was sacred. They were pagans, fierce, aggressive, and extremely averse to Christianity. It was enough for Charlemagne. He began the campaign that would become his most notorious, the Saxon Wars, in 772. The Saxons, bless their forest-dwelling hearts, refused to roll over. Thus, within the course of 30 years, there were 18 distinct campaigns rather than a single battle. It went nicely at first. After charging into Saxony, Charlemagne destroyed the Holy Irminsul, which was essentially their holy tree, and proclaimed that it was time for people to embrace Christianity. As any proud warrior people would, the Saxons reacted. They gave him a kind grin and said, "Sure, no problem." But as soon as his army departed, they rebelled. This kept happening. At sword point, Charlemagne would baptize a few thousand frightened people, smash resistance, and then march in and depart. The Saxons would then return to worshipping their ancient gods after torturing the church and murdering the priests. The most infamous incident occurred following a great uprising in 782. Approximately 4,500 Saxons were put to death in a single day at the massacre of Verdun, which Charlemagne ordered. Even by medieval standards it was cruel, and it made a statement. Conversion was required, it was not an option. Now spiritual obedience was what Charlemagne desired, not only compliance. He sincerely felt that saving souls, even if it meant using steel and fire, was his Christian obligation. His forces were accompanied by monks, churches were constructed as fast as fortifications, and what Saxon would deny, baptism. Let's just say that backup swords were included with the baptismal font. However, despite his best efforts, the Saxons refused to remain subdued. Charlemagne's patience was put to the strain when Frankish warriors were buried in the woodlands of northern Germany. The battle continued year after year, uprising after uprising. In addition to becoming a conqueror, Charlemagne had a fondness for books. Yes, this man started one of the most significant educational revivals in Europe, in addition to forcing Saxons into reluctant baptism for decades. Introducing the Carolingian Renaissance, a movement that focused more on ensuring that monks could spell words correctly than it did on oil painting. Charlemagne had a problem, you see. The priests, nobility, and officials he depended on were, to put it simply, functionally illiterate, and his empire was expanding more quickly than anybody could manage it. Even the Bible was being imaginatively read, and the administration was turning into a medieval telephone game. Thus Charlemagne took a drastic step. "Education matters," he said. he summoned Europe's top academics to his court. Alcuin of York, a stern Anglo-Saxon scholar who likely saw poor Latin the way contemporary editors do funny sons, was foremost among them. Charlemagne established palace schools, established curricular requirements, and mandated that monasteries serve as classrooms under Alcuin's direction. Nor was this reserved for aristocrats. Everyone should have at least a chance to learn to read and write, including peasants, priests, and scribes, according to Charlemagne. Naturally, in Latin. Because if you can't read the Vulgate, what good is education? Ironically, Charlemagne himself was hardly read, in spite of his strong advocacy for education. He was multilingual, but could he read? Composing? Hey, he made an effort to learn. He reportedly kept wax tablets beneath his pillow so he could write at night. But handwriting wasn't exactly a priority when running an empire. Charlemagne, however, set an example. Knowledge was important to him. He held academics in high regard. He even made handwriting uniform. Yes, he created the clear, readable script known as Carolingian minuscule, which is still imitated in contemporary typefaces. Previously, manuscripts had the appearance of ink that had been spilled during a seizure. His efforts resulted in the preservation of thousands of ancient books. Manuscripts were copied by monks as if they were vital. Because they did occasionally, rates of literacy increased. The church started to make more sense. Additionally, Europe cautiously emerged from the Dark Ages. In the year 800 AD, it was Christmas Day. Like a good Christian ruler, Charlemagne was attending Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, while the streets of Rome were chilly and the churches were crowded. Until Pope Leo III executed one of the most spectacular surprise maneuvers in medieval history. That is at least what everyone believed. The Pope crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans when he was kneeling in prayer and abruptly placed a golden crown on his head. As simple as that. Not a warning, not a formal ceremony, no nice. Charles, would you like to become emperor? Not at all. Suddenly you have an empire. Whether Charlemagne was aware that this would occur is still up for debate among historians. Some claim he was caught off surprise, while others claim it was staged. In a very emperor-like move, Charlemagne subsequently stated that he would never have gone into the church if he had known. In any case, there was a great deal of symbolic meaning. In 476, the Roman Empire had collapsed. With Charlemagne as its new leader, the Pope was now essentially reviving it more than 3 centuries later. Overseeing a patchwork of Germanic tribes, Lombards, and Latin-speaking clergy, the Church anointed a Frankish king. Though that name would not be used for some time, the Holy Roman Empire came into being. Everything changed at this time. Charlemagne's power was now spiritual and divine in addition to military. With the Pope as his ally and spiritual advisor, he was now viewed as the Caesar's heir, a Christian Caesar. Not everyone, however, was overjoyed. For ages, the Byzantines in Constantinople had referred to themselves as Roman emperors, and they did not like a Frankish newcomer posing as an emperor in the West. Diplomatic relations were strained for decades, with treaties scrawled under duress and titles tossed about like insults. But the titles stayed back home. From enacting laws to reorganizing the church, Charlemagne's reign as emperor, which lasted until his death in the 16th century, gave weight to all he accomplished. It was the pinnacle of his reign, a crown composed of myth, legitimacy, and historical drama in addition to money. It's impressive to have conquered half of Europe. The true magic trick is to keep it going without the entire thing erupting into civil war. Strangely enough, Charlemagne accomplished this not only with steel and blood, but also with pen, messengers, monks, and spreadsheets from the Middle Ages. Charlemagne took government seriously after ascending to the throne. He began creating a structure that resembled an early kind of contemporary bureaucracy, but with more Latin and a little less bribery, because he understood he couldn't be everywhere at once. Most likely, The Missi Dominici, or literally the Lord's envoys, were at the center of his administration. They were trustworthy officials who traveled the empire giving royal instructions, checking on local lords and making sure no one was secretly establishing their own little kingdom in the backcountry. They were always dispatched in couples, typically one noble and one bishop. Imagine them like medieval auditors, but with divine support and swords. Although they still held regional authority, local counts and dukes were subordinate to Charlemagne. What if they didn't? A pleasant visit from a Mrs. Dominicus could easily escalate into a talk that ends your job. When it came to treason, Charlemagne did not practice tolerance. In addition, he established written rules, orders, and capitularies that were enforced throughout the empire. These addressed everything from the proper bread to serve at imperial feasts, to the number of soldiers a noble had to supply and how to manage a monastery. Yes, even bread regulations are necessary since poorly prepared loaves cannot lead an empire to collapse. However, this went beyond simple micromanagement. According to Charlemagne, a stable, well-functioning empire was a reflection of divine favor. He also believed in order, namely Christian order. His laws were moral as well as lawful. He desired a society in which everyone understood their responsibilities, paid taxes to him and the church, and prayed at the appropriate times, ideally beneath a roof that he had personally approved. Communication was slow, corruption persisted, and occasionally local lords would covertly disobey commands while no one was looking. However, it was amazingly effective for a man in charge of a region spanning from the Pyrenees to the Elbe. Charlemagne's dominion grew to be the largest in Europe since the fall of Rome in the early 800s. His sphere of influence encompassed regions that may cause frostbite to a bishop in July, including northern Italy, sections of Central Europe, and modern-day France and Germany. Despite ruling over Catholics, pagan people, semi-Christianized tribes, ambitious lords, and temperamental bishops, the guy managed to keep everyone in line. At first glance, everything appeared to be magnificent. Law and order had a somewhat uniform shape. Monks were transcribing manuscripts like caffeinated scribes, and the Carolingian Renaissance was in full gear. Nothing says "I'm in charge" like sticking your face in every pocket. Thus, even coinage had Charlemagne's picture, gazing sternly in profile. But beneath the majesty, fissures were appearing. First, succession. Through a revolving cast of brides and concubines, Charlemagne had a large number of children, at least 18, but only a small number were deemed politically viable. Like his father, he had formally divided the empire among 3 sons. One died next, followed by another. Louis the Pious, the youngest and, well, the most monastic of his heirs, was all that remained of him by 806. Louis was calm, considerate, courteous, and a devout Christian. To put it another way, Charlemagne's complete opposite. Giving your empire to someone who values psalms more than politics seems perilous when it relies on coercion and iron will. Then came the aristocracy. They were restrained during Charlemagne's rule by sheer terror and effectiveness. Even so, local counts were becoming more audacious. While some considered royal rules as courteous recommendations, others enthusiastically implemented them. One man's presence and a limited number of backup systems kept the empire stable, but it was a personality cult. The pressure was mounting as a result of the never-ending conflicts, ongoing uprisings, particularly from the partially subdued Saxons, and the expense of sustaining soldiers. Even the church had its own goals despite its general loyalty. Bishops held political authority, abbots ruled over large territories, and while they supported Charlemagne's reign on the one hand, they occasionally resisted on the other, particularly when the demands of the monarchy conflicted with canon law or monastery finances. Although the empire was amazing, it relied on a single person with all-encompassing authority, as is the case with anything constructed quickly and extensively. That individual was also growing older. Charlemagne was sick in the winter of 814. He was at his favorite palace city, Aachen, surrounded by counselors, professors, and the odor of ink-stained paper and burnt firewood. His age of 72 was almost amazing for someone who had fought in battles, traversed mountains, and ensured that all the nobility knew who was in charge for decades. His fall was gradual and nearly silent, despite his reputation as a warrior. According to his loyal biographer Einhard, he prayed, fasted, and accepted death with the composed majesty of a Christian ruler. The death of Charlemagne occurred on January 28, 814. The bells rung, the empire waited. He was buried in the Cathedral of Aachen under a marble throne, with a copy of the Gospels in his lap, a sword by his side, and imperial robes wrapped around him. For a man who had once been crowned emperor of the Romans in a surprise ceremony, it was not a terrible farewell. He sat straight in his tomb like a sleeping king according to later stories, ready to rise again if the empire ever required him. Of course, romantic bullshit. However, telling. The entire empire, with its clumsy borders, disobedient nobility, and escalating instability, was passed down to Louis the Pious, his only surviving son. Louis made an effort to govern effectively. He did. He wasn't his father, though. The iron hold relaxed. Power was divided. Civil wars erupted. France and Germany became independent kingdoms when Charlemagne's vast empire was divided into fragments within a few decades. Nevertheless, Charlemagne's empire did not erase his legacy. It expanded. Carolus Magnus, the perfect Christian ruler, became a legendary character. Popes called to mind his recollection. Emperors fashioned themselves after him. He was regarded as the spiritual father of the Holy Roman Empire, which was established several years after his death. In an attempt to capture some of that ancient celestial radiance, Napoleon, centuries later, even modeled his coronation after Charlemagne's. Charlemagne accomplished more than merely bring Europe together. He provided it with a model combining Christian doctrine, Germanic royalty, and Roman law. He sowed the seeds for the countries that would constitute a continent and assisted in pulling it from the ashes of the Dark Ages. The world lost a man when he passed away. However, it acquired a legend, and legends are much more difficult to dispel, as Europe would repeatedly demonstrate. There was more to a medieval feast than just eating. Being noticed was the goal. Imagine this. Long wooden tables covered with cloth, stone walls with shadows cast by flickering torches, and the aroma of roasted boar blending with wine, perspiration, and aspirations. It wasn't dinner, it was theatre. Additionally, each spoonful served, each seat, and each dish were all a part of a meticulously planned social ritual. Feasts allowed the ruling elite to remind everyone of their position in a society where rank was fixed by birth. The placement of seats was a political chess play. Both in terms of furnishings and prestige, the lord and lady were literally elevated as they sat at the high table. You were more significant the closer you sat to them. Not only were you cold, but you were disposable if you were standing next to the musicians, staring at a draughty wall. Like acts in a play, the food came in waves or removals. As a decorative touch, the first course may include stuffed peacocks with their feathers restored. Then came doves in pie crusts, swans, roasted boars' heads with apples in their mouths, and platters of venison. Not a little bit. The animal was probably staring back at you now, covered in wine sauce, if it had ever had a face. And there were the nuances after that. Intricate food sculptures fashioned from sugar, marzipan, or pastry that depict biblical epic scenes, castles, saints, or mythological creatures. These were intended to be viewed or gawked at, ideally both, rather than consumed. But showing off affluence wasn't the only goal. Feasts served as political instruments. Between pheasant bites, treaties were arranged. Over goblets of spiced wine, alliances were forged. In between classes, marriages were arranged. A poor feast could damage a person's reputation. having a fantastic one? Years of loyalty may be purchased with that. Silence has purpose too. It wasn't only free speech for guests. They timed the toasts. Conversations were triggered by music. A juggler could entertain during an uncomfortable silence. A poet may say something so sweet that the bore seemed uninteresting. The castle kitchen, the setting for every lavish medieval feast, was a place of exquisite chaos. Not your comfortable contemporary room with herb gardens and tiled worktops. No, this was a wood-fired, smoky, yelling combat zone with a hierarchy that would redden a small army. The master cook, the Gordon Ramsay of his era, minus the profanity, or to use Latin, with more profanity, was at the summit of this culinary command tower. He was in charge of dozens of helpers, spit-turners, potboys, pastry makers, fish cleaners, saucemen, and at least one unfortunate person who spent the entire day simply picking chickens and not cooking 2 or 3 dishes. Because cookbooks were handmade, scarce, and more securely locked than certain treasure boxes, they were manufacturing hundreds of them, often without a single written recipe. Day and night the fire in the kitchen roared. There were no thermostats, only prayer, guessing, and burnt palms. On enormous spits that were manually spun, generally by young boys whose arms were constantly rotating, meat was grilled. What about the meat size? Assume that over a 3-day feast a cow may appear in fragments. Sauces were essential. A mixture of wine, vinegar, and unusual spices covered everything. Spices were riches, not because they were trying to cover up rotten food, as the myth claims would have offended the guests. Cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and saffron. These were luxury imports. Serving them was a way to show off trade ties as much as it was about flavor. This chicken was essentially medieval for me because it tasted like cinnamon. Although it was a mainstay, bread belonged to distinct social levels. The exquisite white manship bread was given to the nobility. The coarser brown loaves were consumed by the servants. Every dish had a trench underneath it, a stale piece of bread that served as a plate to absorb all the oily liquids, and was either consumed by the lower classes or tossed to the dogs, depending on how polite the dog is, either one or both. The odor? A mixture of fire, sweat, yeast, meat, and herbs. The sound? Continuous yelling, clanging, and the sporadic squawk of a goose that hasn't come to terms with its fate. It was effective, yet it lacked glamour. And without it, all the pretense of easy nobility upstairs would have crumbled like a pie gone bad. Congratulations! You were either wealthy, influential, or someone's political pawn if you were ever invited to a medieval feast. However, what did land on your plate? To put it mildly, you might want to turn away if you're a finicky eater. At the dinner, meat was king. If you were dining on a really quirky beach, you might see deer, wild boar, rabbits, pheasants, swans, and even porpoises. Literally everything that could swim, fly, walk, or even somewhat resemble flesh was fair game. Hunting served as a supply chain and a sport. While dining, nobles went out and slaughtered the food they would later boast about. Additionally, an animal's status increases with its rarity. The main attraction was the whole roasted animals. Imagine a swan, a whole pig, its nose cleaned, its teeth exposed, or an apple in its mouth. After cooking, feathers were reapplied due to presentation. It was meant to appear majestic now if it had previously appeared menacing. However, quantity wasn't the only factor. The menu was well planned. You didn't just throw everything on the table, it was served in removes or courses. If it was Friday and the church was present, the first might consist of light fare, soups, little pies, and fish. Subsequent classes advanced to the more difficult ones, pies filled with meat, game, roasts, and more meat. Particularly during times of fasting, fish got its own moment in the spotlight. Herring, pike, and eels were regular visitors. Although they were occasionally shaped like animals, they were most obviously not, because serving a fish that resembles a hedgehog is more appealing than a dull-boiled fish. The spices, too. The spices. Oh, people in the Middle Ages didn't think bland was real. Chicken with cinnamon? Of course. Gravy with ginger? Naturally. Meat with sugar? Why not? On the same dish and occasionally on the same mouthful, sweet and savory coexisted peacefully. In contrast, noble dishes were suspiciously devoid of vegetables. Greens and root vegetables were frequently seen as peasant fare. Too earthy, too humble. Turnips were disliked by lords until they were packed into a unicorn-shaped pastry. The cuisine changed from being tame to theatrical by the end of the feast. Hunger was not the objective. Dessert might be breathing fire, so the idea was to dazzle, overwhelm, and leave your guests feeling full, surprised, and maybe a little scared of what's coming next. A medieval feast wouldn't be complete without entertainment, and plenty of it, even though the food served to clog arteries and indicate affluence. You did more than eat. You stared, you listened, you winced sometimes, and you laughed at whatever happened in between courses. Enter the fool, the court jester, who generally has the chutzpah to mock the host without being decapitated because of his bells and mismatched colors. The fool's role was to create a sense of controlled chaos, make people laugh, and make fun of the powerful. They did comedy performances, juggled and told obscene stories with the skill of someone who understood that one poor joke may result in execution or unemployment. With their lutes, harps, and voices honed in tunes about love, war, and the odd dragon, the minstrels then appeared. The hall was filled with music, not just for background noise, but as an integral part of the experience. These songs were more than just mood songs, they were historical documents, political commentary, and musical flattery. Congratulations. The minstrel would have a nice meal tonight if the lord of the house was courageously featured in the third verse. You had fire breathers and acrobats for something more flamboyant. Real fire indeed. Inside was a wooden hall with tapestries and rushes. Safety codes were only a pipe dream. There were appearances of animal tamers, sword swallowers, and even dancing bears, albeit the bears weren't always happy about it. And there were the nuances after that, performances that are edible, political satire disguised as sugar sculptures. For dramatic effect, release giant pies with live birds in the middle of the meal. Cutting into a pie and watching doves burst from it while the guests graciously applauded and avoided getting pooped on was the epitome of wealth. Some feasts featured little theatrical acts about virtue, immorality, or the perils of disregarding the church, as well as morality plays. Traveling troops or monks who were too eager to play the devil sometimes performed these. It was all calculated. In between sips of mead, entertainment kept the atmosphere light, diverted attention from political stress, and made sure that no guest had time to mutter revolt. A skilled performer could avert a duel. One could be started by a bad one. You weren't merely taking in a performance at a medieval feast. The laughter and the show were you. That was just one more tactic to keep the host at a distance. Who you ate with was far more significant in the medieval world than what you ate. A feast was a deliciously greasy occasion that included elements of a court negotiation, marriage proposal, corporate takeover, and press conference in the medieval era. It was more than just hospitality to host a feast. It was a plan. It was a sign of riches, authority, giving, and dominance. Additionally, every component, from sauce selection to seating arrangement, communicated status. Consider seating. There was more to the high table than just its physical elevation. It was radioactive to society. Their most esteemed guests sat on either side of the lord and lady, who occupied the center seat. Visiting nobility, foreign diplomats, and bishops. You were someone if you were close to the salt cellar. The other people were simply content to be in the same cooked air. The phrase "above the salt" originates there. Either you were sitting near the floor with the minstrels and empty wine jugs, or you were near the host and important. They did not distribute invitations like sweets. You were important if you were invited to a feast, and not going. If you made that statement, you might get a visit from armed guys who want to know why your chair was empty. On the other hand, you might be switching sides if you went to a rival's feast. A political minefield was present on every guest list. The meal itself was a message. A visiting duke could be flattered if a certain local specialty was served. Providing a wealth of game meant that my lands are large and well stocked. I have trade contacts you can only imagine, including foreign spices. Meaning could even be found in wine. Did it happen locally, brought in? Has a bishop blessed you? The presents came next. Offerings were occasionally brought by visitors. They were supposed to thank the host in exchange for jewels, antiques, and horses. Toasts were a combination of performance, flattery, and occasionally caution. Alliances also took place at feasts. Honeyed quail could be used to seal a marital match. The third remove settled a land dispute. If nothing else worked, a rival ruler might be rendered too poisoned to wake up the following morning, or inebriated to sign a foolish document. Despite its excess and opulence, medieval feasting was greatly influenced by the church, the one institution that even kings respected. Furthermore, the church held strong beliefs about what one should eat, when one should eat it, and how guilty one should feel afterward. There were more fasting days than feasting days in the medieval calendar. That isn't overstating things. Dietary restrictions were in place for over half the year. You name it. Wednesdays, Fridays, Advent, Lent, and other vigils. Additionally, meat from land animals was literally off the menu these days. So how did the aristocracy handle it? With originality. They continued to host feasts. They just changed the components. Beef, pork, and venison were discarded. Fish, eggs, nuts, and anything else that could pass for something other than flesh arrived. For instance, because beaver tails were aquatic and scaly, they were regarded as fish. The issue has been resolved. Loopholes are acceptable to God, right? Foods evolved into culinary tricks. Almond milk was shaped into fake cheese by chefs. They made mock roasts out of fish. Technically, some meals were within the restrictions, but they looked sinful. Wine, of course, was not considered food. It never does. But it was open season on feast days when people celebrated saints or holy occasions. Additionally, the church held its own festivities, Christmas, Easter, and Epiphany. They were more than just holy. They had licenses to eat anything they could find. With each meal growing larger and more ridiculous than the last, a Christmas feast may endure for 12 whole days. Christ is born like a pie with 4 different kinds of birds inside, because nothing speaks, and monasteries were no exception. Monks were expected to lead modest lives, yet several abbeys gained notoriety for their culinary prowess. An affluent monastery may fast on spicy eel and oysters. In order to keep their bellies full and their faults technical, monks created exact meal plans that included seasonal menus and replacements that were laden with loopholes. Food, however, was a spiritual matter. Feasting was more than a luxury. The performance was exquisite. You prayed that your cook hadn't served you meat on the incorrect Thursday, offered food to the church thereafter, and expressed gratitude before you ate. During the Middle Ages, overeating was considered a sin. But having a holy banquet? It amounted to a sacrament. A medieval feast was not a free-for-all, despite all the juggling idiots and roasting boars. There were a lot of rules. In fact, you had to know how to act like a genuine greasy-fingered aristocrat if you wanted to maintain your position and your status. The first rule is to avoid peasant behavior when handling the food. People ate primarily with their fingers because forks were not yet common, but there was a method to it. Unless you wished to spread gossip about witchcraft or bad hygiene, you only ever used the first 3 fingers of your right hand. Second, wait until the meal is over before licking your fingers. Rinsing your hands in a communal sink in between courses was entirely okay, but licking them while eating, that was akin to being French in an English castle or arriving barefoot. Additionally, each visitor brought their own knife. Only food and a place to store it were provided by your host, no silverware. Like a medieval iPhone, your knife was more than just a tool for chopping. It was a statement piece. Stylish handle. You are significant. A rusty blade. Savor your time spent by the fire. Drinking manners were a battleground in and of themselves. You didn't drink too much wine. You took a toast. You took a sip. If you wished to gently challenge your neighbor to a duel later, or were requesting a favor, you presented them the cup. You did share goblets too. Lip contact was not a concern because germ theory had not yet been developed, and everyone was too busy dying of plague. Then there was discussion. You were supposed to speak, but not excessively. Don't laugh too loudly. Give the food credit, but not the host more. Don't burp unless you're Mongolian, intoxicated, or both. And don't talk with your mouth full unless you're disparaging a rival. Hand-washing customs were almost ceremonial during richer feasts. In order to remind everyone of their sophistication, servers would frequently wash their hands with perfumed water before the first course and again before dessert. Being courteous was not etiquette. It was about establishing your place. You were no longer enjoying a feast with lords after one mishap, a spilled glass of wine, a filthy sleeve, or reaching too far across the table. They didn't share the wine when you returned with the dogs. The final toast was made, the last swan was sliced, and the idiot was led away to juggle bread rolls in a bishop's chalice. There was still one question. How did the food turn out? An absurd amount of it was generated at medieval feasts. Pies, bread trenches dripping with meat, sugar castles, jellied fish, and boars. Even the most ravenous nobleman could not finish it. Waste, however, was also a luxury. The message conveyed by what you served was equally as loud as the one you didn't eat. Where did everything go then? It went to the servants, if you were lucky. After the feast, they ate in shifts, sifting through the leftovers from the lower tables. They occasionally received choice cuts, particularly if a favorite diner chose not to eat the stuffed hedgehog pastry or handed along their untouched roast. It was better than porridge, but it wasn't fancy. The thick piece of bread that served as a platter was known as trencher bread. The aristocrats hardly ever ate it unless they were really inebriated, since it was so laden with sauces and oil. Rather, these damp slabs were gathered and frequently given to the underprivileged. I'm not saying this for charity, more like to aristocrats stating, "Here are the remnants of our greatness." However, a slab drenched in seasoned boar fat was preferable to a sermon on humility if you were a peasant. Feast leftovers were turned into alms in churches and monasteries. It was expected, not just encouraged, to feed the impoverished. As a moral obligation, leftovers were collected into baskets, blessed, possibly after the fingers were selected, and distributed. Following the departure of the aristocrats, the poor were occasionally even welcome to eat in the Great Hall, but in a completely different location and typically without the juggling bear. However, not all of it ended up in hungry hands. Some of it was composted in castle midden piles, fed to pigs or just thrown out. Why? Because a surplus demonstrated riches in medieval high society. Restraint was overvalued. It was part of the act to let food deteriorate in silence behind the kitchen door. Therefore, life continued for the rest of the nobles while they sobered up and congratulated themselves on a well-hosted feast. Dogs fighting over fish heads, peasants forming a line for trenches, and servants munching on bones, because even leftovers had a rank in the medieval world. Half of the guests were face down in pie crusts, the candles were low, the minstrels were snoozing beneath seats, and the other half were stumbling around the castle hallways in search of their shoes, or dignity. The feast was over, but the ceremony for the following morning was quite different. Even before the visitors departed, clean-up got underway. Like ghosts, servants swept rushes off the floor, scraped trenches and cleared bones. Those fragrant herbs strewn about to cover up the stench of sweat, alcohol spills, and aristocratic feces. Rushes needed to be changed frequently, particularly after a feast where more than simply crumbs were absorbed by the floor. The reckoning followed. The damage was evaluated by the steward, who was effectively the medieval party planner. A surprising amount of gravy was spilled close to the bishop's seat, and there were broken goblets and missing cutlery. Everything was included in the report. As a strange badge of honor, guests occasionally even stole silverware. You were considered significant enough to dare if you departed with a spoon. A battleground was the kitchen. Broken plates, charred pots, and enough oil to lubricate a drawbridge. Cooks stumbled out like survivors, some complaining that they should just serve oatmeal the next time, and others losing eyebrows from the oven fire. But the actual work had only just begun for the host. Gratitude politics took over, gifts were sent, letters were written, and praises were given. Grudges could arise if a prominent guest was not adequately appreciated, or worse, if they were placed too far away from the roast swan. Medieval resentments also had a tendency to escalate into feuds or even wars. Sometimes an alliance was offended, a feast backfired, a guest was insulted, or a drunken noble confessed to treachery over mulled wine. Months of diplomatic efforts could be ruined by one poorly timed toast. Yes, the feast was a performance, but the reviews may kill you just like in any theatre. The following morning was routine for the lower classes. Some were lucky enough to discover a lost almond cake crust behind the dais, while others shoveled trash and cleaned dishes. Breakfast was that. The castle then silently settled back into rhythm. The torches were extinguished, the banners were lowered, and the dogs were fed. The feasting season was over until the next event, wedding, coronation, or reason to impress the neighbours. However, its echoes persisted, resembling wine stains on the stone and smoke in the rafters, because no one ever remembers a good feast or a terrible one in the medieval era. It was hardly a tranquil birth for Leif Erikson. He was born into a family of exile, ambition, and really terrible impulse control, sometime around the year 970, either in Iceland or Greenland, depending on which saga you're attempting to decipher. Eric the Red, his father, was a fiery Norwegian criminal who was banished for murder and then deported from Iceland for, surprise, murder again. Eric found Greenland instead of learning to limit himself. Why not claim another frozen island if you're going to be barred from the first one? Leif was raised in this rough frontier village where the only reliable export was stories. The winters were harsh and there were few neighbours. The colony of Greenland did not prosper. The only things keeping the outpost afloat were fish, driftwood, and determination. However, it provided Leif with perspective, which was more important than comfort. He was aware of what it was like to live on the fringe of civilization. He came from a Norse family that was hard-drinking, hard-fighting, and always skeptical of authority. But despite this rough society, Leif was unique. He was inquisitive, thoughtful, and perceptive. The sagas describe him as tall, muscular, attractive, naturally endowed with a keener sense of mind than his erratic father. He was not brought up with scholars or scrolls. He grew up on oral legends of gods, monsters, adventures, and retribution, known as sagas. These were not lullabies for bedtime. They were mythologically encased survival guides that crept into Leif like sea brine into the hull of a longship. The remoteness of Greenland made young Leif yearn for more. In contrast to his father, whose aspirations resulted in exile and violence, Leif turned his gaze to the horizon, Iceland and Norway. Old sailors told him about mysterious places that lay beyond the ice. He observed the tides and studied the stars. He was more than just Eric the Red's kid by the time he was an adult. He had a boat, a brain, and a strong desire to discover everything that wasn't a frozen rock with frozen egos. He was a Norseman. Leif Erikson was a boy born of fire and ice, destined to outrun both before he ever set sail west, before the church called, before his name appeared in sagas and textbooks. Leif's rise to fame wasn't a coincidence. He entered it via sailing. Leif departed Greenland at some point in his early adulthood to visit Norway, the ancient center of Norse sovereignty. It went beyond a simple homecoming. It was an encounter with a world that was startlingly holy, hierarchical, and far more advanced, because Norway has changed since his father's escape. King Olaf Tryggvason, who had a sword, a crown, and a genuine obsession with converting the Norse to Christianity, whether they wanted it or not, now governed it. Leif was confronted by Olaf, a Christian warrior king who had substituted churches for longships and baptisms for blood feuds. And Leif did not scoff, in contrast to many of his compatriots. He paid attention. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was diplomacy, or maybe Leif had had enough of the never-ending cycle of raids, retaliation, and gods who mostly wanted beer and blood. Regardless of the cause, Leif was baptized, converted to Christianity, and assigned the new task of evangelizing Greenland. The task wasn't particularly simple. Imagine attempting to explain monotheism to a group of farmers who frequently offered goat sacrifices to Thor during unusual weather conditions. Still largely faithful to Odin, Freya, and the rest of the thunder-happy clan, Greenland was aloof and wary of strangers. Leif, however, did not come away empty-handed. He provided royal support, clerics, and knowledge. He wasn't just a chieftain's son when he returned to Greenland. He represented both a new god and a king. Even if he didn't precisely start a renaissance right away, his influence started to grow. In tiny, icy rings, Christianity began to spread. Chapels were constructed. They held up crosses. Although they faced fierce competition, the old gods weren't instantly displaced. This was a watershed moment. Leif was no longer merely a settler or a sailor. He was a guy who stood between two worlds, written law and pagan legend, Norse custom and Christian order, and a bridge of cultures. Leif Erikson had one foot in Bethlehem and one in Valhalla. In between converting his neighbors and preserving the tenuous peace, he started to hear stories about strange places to the west that had forests, grapes, and no winter. The call was for the next great journey. Ambition is the first step towards some amazing discoveries. Others start with poor navigation. In addition to bringing Christianity to Greenland, Leif Erikson had sailed sail from Norway, with the admirable goal of perhaps keeping tabs on the family drama. However, destiny, or possibly the infamously erratic weather of the North Atlantic, had other ideas. The Greenlander's tale states that Leif heard rumors about an unfamiliar region in the far west that had been sighted by a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson years before. Bjarni had spotted unidentified coasts but had never bothered to land. A man who found North America and then continued to sail as if he had goods in the rear is known as classic Bjarni, but Leif was a different kind of timber. He purchased Bjarni's ship in the year 1000, assembled a crew, and made the decision to explore what was out there. Not all he was doing was sailing into the future. He was heading for renown. The trip was dangerous. Things were kept interesting by icebergs, storms, and the actual risk of plunging off the edge of the world. However, Leif was composed, stable, and, according to the sagas, obnoxious, competent. His ship eventually arrived to a location that was considerably different from Greenland. He began with a desolate area he called Helluland, which is probably present-day Baffin Island. It is flat, stony, and unimpressive. Next came Markland, which was most likely Labrador and had forests dense enough to support a whole fleet. Not quite the promised land, but useful. At last Leif reached a location so resource-rich and temperate that his company called it Vinland, or the land of wine, or grapes, or berries that have fermented. Norsemen were not precisely sommeliers, and the sagas are ambiguous. In any case, the location was a haven from the freezing death trap they lived in. They explored rivers, constructed homes, and relished the novelty of not having to dig a hole in a glacier to get their drinking water. The primary settlement was dubbed Leif's Budia, Leif's Booths, by Leif, a modest moniker for a man who unintentionally creates history. During the winter, he mapped the area, collected lumber, and wrote tales that, when he returned, would rock the north. No great conquests occurred, no conflicts, just quiet, useful investigation, remarkably contemporary for a Viking. Leif didn't claim ownership or plant flags. He simply watched, gave a name, and walked away. Nevertheless, he became the first European to enter North America by doing this. Prior to Columbus, prior to maps, before his actions were discovered, a new Norse golden era ought to have begun with Leif Erikson's arrival in Vinland. Mild weather, wild grapes, tall wood, no frostbite. What more is there for a Greenlander? However, it turns out that utopia has drawbacks, particularly if you don't ask the locals if tourists are welcome. The sagas describe Leif and his men spending a winter in Vinland, where they gathered precious resources and built shelters. They discovered enormous forests, crops that grew on its own, and enough fish to feed a saga's worth of warriors. It was more than just a finding, it was a remedy. Greenland was remote, desolate, and frigid. Vinland was full of possibilities and temperate. Leif, however, did not colonize it. He didn't construct a church, import a second shipload of immigrants, or claim it in the king's name. He just brought a cargo hold full of timber and a story that no one could believe was true back to Greenland. Why? Although the sagas don't elaborate, it appears from what followed that Leif was aware that Vinland wasn't deserted. His sister Freydis, brother Thorvald, and other Norse explorers would later engage in bloody conflicts with the native peoples they dubbed the Skraelings. It is still up for question who these people were, but they were probably the progenitors of the Micmac, Beothuk, or Inuit of today. It's obvious that they weren't happy about strangers with axes and a sense of entitlement showing there with heavy weapons. Leif may have felt that this area was not theirs to capture, even if there was no bloodshed during his trip. He made no effort to conquer. He didn't set communities on fire. He did not leave a trail of churches and dead. Rather, he departed in silence. Generations would be plagued by the memory of Vinland's promise, a land so near, so rich, yet inaccessible. Subsequent expeditions would attempt to resolve it, but the notion never persisted because of the conflict with the indigenous peoples, the extreme distance from assistance, and the risks of overextending. Ultimately, Leif's revelation came too soon. The world of Norsemen was not prepared. There were too few settlers, the politics were too precarious, and the ocean was too big. Part ghost, part Eden, Vinland vanished into legend. Leif, too? He came back to Greenland as a guy who had witnessed something that no one else had, not as a victor. There is a world out there, but not for them. Neither gold nor honor greeted Leif Erikson's return from Vinland. He introduced Christianity, which is even more contentious. King Olaf Tryggvason, who regarded the sword and the cross as equally legitimate instruments for establishing a nation, had ordered Leif to be baptized back in Norway. Leif had quietly, thoughtfully, and without fanfare embraced the new faith. Now, however, he came to Greenland as an evangelist and an explorer, accompanied by a ship full of priests with a royal mandate. but Greenland had remained the same without him. Norse paganism continued to rule the colony. During snowstorms, the people continued to murmur prayers to Thor, drink to Odin, and carve runes. They were settlers, survivors, passionately traditional and pragmatic. They also harbored strong misgivings about a religion that claimed that all of their gods were fake and that it might be improper to drink blood on the winter solstice. Leif did not burn idols or storm temples. He wasn't like that. Rather, he relied on the weight of royal support, charity, and diplomacy. He constructed what is said to be Greenland's first church. He provided refuge to priests, conversed with chiefs, and shared tales of a kinder world outside of exile and cold, in addition to Christ. Theodild, his own mother, converted and constructed her own chapel. Eric the Red, his father, famously declined. Eric had no desire to associate with this new deity who didn't even use a hammer in combat and didn't appreciate a good blood sacrifice. Christianity was weakness to Eric. It was a way forward for Leif. The wider division in Greenland was reflected in this familial division. Some accepted the faith because they believed it would advance society, provide security, or simply be another method to win the king's favor. Some dismissed it as unfamiliar sounds. Traditionalists and converts were equally suspicious and angry. Leif did not impose his will. He merely lived it. He was a Christian and a Norseman, a settler and a seafarer. He became a symbol of balance, of growth without erasure, and of faith because of his peaceful power. He simply ceased calling on the ancient gods. He didn't slay them. And even if it took years to develop, his example was sufficient to sow the seeds of something new for a colony on the edge of the earth. Despite carving his own reputation across the North Atlantic, Leif Erikson did so in the shadow of a lengthy, blood-stained past. His dad's. In addition to being notorious, Eric the Red was almost legendary. The guy who created Greenland was a pioneer, a brawler, and an exile from Iceland and Norway who needed a new place to go to. Everywhere he went, neighbors had axes handy and policemen winced. His charisma was much more renowned than his fury. Growing up in Eric's home also taught Leif to walk a tightrope between being brave and being careless, between being a leader and being crazy. Leif was frost, where Eric was fire. People followed him even though he didn't yell or threaten. His composure was admired by the Greenlanders. He used guidance rather than a blade to conquer. The analogy persisted even though it might have been precisely what the colony needed. Leif came back from Vineland with timber and tales instead of gold. While Eric pouted and sneered, his Christian mission in Greenland gradually gained traction. To carry on his violent tradition, the elderly father had desired a warrior son. Rather, he received a believer, an adventurer, and someone who valued diplomacy over steel. That was interpreted as wisdom by some and weakness by others. Leif was unconcerned. He was just surviving Eric, not attempting to outdo him. Some think Eric the Red's death was a gradual surrender of spirit, while others attribute it to disease. It was the end of a particular type of Norseman. Eric stood for the world of exile, ancient gods, and aroused pride. Leif stood for something different, a future that saw past blood feuds and frigid fjords. Their connection appears tense in the sagas. Leif's new faith irritates Eric. Neither bends when Leif tries to convert him. However, there is a subliminal sense of appreciation and respect. Eric may have secretly been relieved that his son wasn't like him. Leif never ascended to the throne and never used force. However, he outlived his father in both history and spirituality. He guided Greenland into a new era that was more sustainable but perhaps less dramatic. And sometimes being great is about rejecting to inherit your father's problems rather than conquering them. Leif Erikson did not pursue further fame after Vinland, after the church building, and after Eric the Red was gone. He made no attempt to capture new territory or go on a second trip. He stayed at home instead, which was a very un-Viking thing to do. Leif spent the remainder of his life at the community his father had established in Brattleid, Greenland. Leif, however, controlled with more composure than Eric, who did it with brute force. Indeed, he rose to the position of chief, but more than that, he came to represent continuity and quiet leadership in a world that was starting to change, not violence. His name disappears from dramatic action and instead lingers as a presence respected and remembered, but no longer at the center of the storm. We know very little about these later years, and the sagas become hazy. He brought up a family, and Thorkel Leifson, his son, would eventually become the leader of Greenland. The colony persisted, and Christianity grew gradually, but Vineland, which ought to have revolutionized everything, failed. Others attempted to trail behind him. Native resistance resulted to the death of his brother Thorvald, who went west. Freydis, his sister, commanded an expedition that was full of axe murders, betrayal, and poor choices. The Norse world wasn't prepared, not the land, which is why every attempt to colonize Vinland failed. Leif knew the risks of distance, animosity, and lack of support, which is why he chose not to go back. He had demonstrated that the journey was feasible and had witnessed what was on the other side of the ocean, but he also understood that Greenland needs stability more than it did heroism. Vinland eventually turned into a mythology that was half dream and half recollection. Leif never yelled his discoveries from the top of mountains, demanded praise, or requested songs. Some people didn't believe it, but he didn't need them because he knew something uncommon. Knowing when to back off is sometimes necessary to make history. As far as we know, he passed away in Greenland quietly and peacefully, not on a ship or on a battlefield, but at home. His last days were probably spent gazing out to sea, reliving the journey that no one believed was conceivable. The Norseman who traveled farther than any other, Leif Erikson, ended his life attaching people to the horizon rather than chasing it. Leif Erikson may have led a quiet life, but his story did not die with him. Rather, it changed, spread, and expanded, being passed down by storytellers rather than historians. And storytellers, as we all know, have a tenuous relationship with the truth. 2 centuries after Leif's death, the Greenlanders and Eric the Red sagas, the main sources for his life, were composed. It would be like attempting to create a biography of Napoleon based on the fishing tales of your great-great-grandfather. They are ominously convenient, dramatic, and detailed. Leif is portrayed as a sort of Norse saint in one epic and as a bold adventurer who gets lost and wanders into North America in another. Others add omens, prophetic dreams, side quests, or anything else that makes the story more engaging than Ailey. Then there is his sister Freydis, who is sometimes characterized as a ferocious warrior woman who screamed and slashed a sword over her bare chest to ward off intruders while she was heavily pregnant. Is it accurate? Maybe not. Do you want to fight her, though? Not at all. The way the sagas weave legend and reality into a narrative is fascinating. Leif didn't brag, but each time he told his story, it became louder. As a Norseman who ventured west before anyone believed it was important, he came to represent adventure, faith, and tenacity. Then, buried under ages of dust and eclipsed by bloodier, louder names, he vanished once more. Historians anxious to discover a European who arrived in America before Columbus brought Leif back to life in the 19th and 20th century. Streets were given names and sculptures sprang out of nowhere. On the basis of only immigration documents, October the 9th was designated as a National Leif Erikson Day in the United States. Leif would have detested all the attention, ironically. He wasn't planting flags or aiming for stardom. As was customary for Norsemen, He was venturing into the unknown and returning with what he could, though he never claimed it. History had other ideas. And now the silent Greenlander, who left behind no publications, speeches, or boasting, is regarded as the guy who found a continent. An empire was never created by Leif Erikson. He didn't engage in large-scale combat. He didn't wear a gold crown or govern a kingdom. Nevertheless, he lives on because he quietly earned his place in history rather than because he demanded it. Leif traveled west into the unknown, driven by curiosity rather than conquest, while others sought renown via blood and fire. He did not call himself a saint or a hero. There were no monuments built by him. He found land, but he made no attempt to hold it. He just left, observed, and came back. An uncommon type of adventurer who didn't require the world to remember his name in order to defend his expedition. Still, it did. Leif's memory endures in tales and sagas that have been passed down through the ages, rewritten by poets, politicians, chroniclers, and bards. The Greenland lad came to represent adventure, tenacity, and silent power. His voyage to Vinland became part of the greater Norse epic, a culture that ventured beyond the boundaries of the known globe in search of opportunity rather than conflict. Leif's life has changed in the modern era. In Boston, Seattle, Trondheim, and Reykjavik, there are statues of him. He is portrayed as a proud Norseman looking west, with his palm over his brow, seemingly still searching the horizon for that dim shoreline of trees. Ships and schools are named after him, and some Americans even recall that he was about 500 years ahead of Columbus on October 9th. However, balance, rather than distance or discovery, may be his greatest legacy. He stood between the old gods and a new religion, chaos and order, Christianity and paganism. He embodied change rather than imposing it. He converted without a crusade, and he led without yelling. He demonstrated that history occasionally rewards people who just do the right thing and return home in silence, and that bravery isn't always loud. Never did Leif Erikson ask to be remembered. His story serves as a reminder that legends aren't always created in a society where noise is frequently mistaken for grandeur.